We have an exciting program today. We're going to hear from Paul Van Orden, who has run the Portland, Oregon Noise Office for 30 of the office's 50 years. This is the 50th anniversary. The office is a model for other communities and a reminder that the return of a federal noise program isn't out of reach.
Thank you, Trish. And it's our pleasure again to welcome Paul Van Orden and to welcome you all to this close-up event. Paul has served as Portland's Noise Control Officer for more than 30 years. Drawing on Portland's rich history of noise regulation, Paul's going to speak today on topics relevant to today's environmental noise challenges that communities around the country are facing. He's built a career in environmental law enforcement that spans nearly 4 decades. His early work in the New Jersey metropolitan area focused on air pollution investigations, noise pollution, hazardous materials, odor enforcement, facility contaminant inspections, and household-led contamination assessment. Pretty comprehensive environmental background. For the past 30 years, Paul has worked for the city of Portland as Oregon's leading environmental health expert on urban acoustics and noise pollution. Since 1996, he's led what is recognized as our nation's first comprehensive citywide noise control office. Drawing on lessons learned in a larger metropolitan area, that of Newark, New Jersey, Paul rewrote Portland's noise codes to include an escalating enforcement approach and a streamlined system for citizen-based complaints and affidavits, expanding community policing opportunities. This progressive enforcement reaches up to $5,000 per citation, and violators can be cited multiple times in a single day. Paul has a long history of taking on challenging and diverse enforcement cases. Past cases have ranged from hexane and heptane air pollution enforcement against a large pharmaceutical company to issuing an enforcement action against the federal government for late-night noise pollution caused by a U.S. Postal Service facility. He brings a unique ability to mediate and resolve complex community noise disputes, drawing on his extensive experience in the city of Portland. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand this over to Paul.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for participating today. I'm going to go ahead and start my slides, and they're a framework for what I'm talking about. There's a lot to cover, but let me get started with sharing the first slide. And tell me when it pops up, and I'll get rolling.
It's there right now.
Okay. So today we're going to chat about the 50 years of the City of Portland's Noise Office, and specifically our regulatory elements, with a little bit of a focus as well on the education components. So the early part of the Noise Office's history goes back to the mid-70s, when my predecessor, the city's first noise control officer, Dr. Paul Herman, helped to get the city of Portland funding to establish a model noise ordinance for other cities to use in the United States in smaller jurisdictions. And so the interesting element was, back in the 70s, there was a fair amount of funding for noise in the United States. We were a national leader at addressing noise as a human health issue. And so the city of Portland was able to garner funding from both the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and interestingly also from HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Dr. Herman's early years at the city, he was there for about 20 years, from the early 70s, as he wrote the noise code. The noise code was adopted by the Portland City Council 50 years ago in July 1976. So this is our 50th anniversary. So Dr. Herman's work for that first 20 years was really working to establish how a program of this nature would work, and offering examples for other cities to be able to model as they develop noise programs. One of the interesting elements is that in those days, there was enough work going on that what started to happen as Dr. Herman established the City of Portland's Noise Office is other jurisdictions came together in a national organization called NANCO, the National Association of Noise Control Officials. So it's hard today to imagine that there was so much robust interest in funding and small towns and cities gathering to have officials talk about how do we regulate noise. But I mention it only because, although it's now a defunct organization, it gives great hope as we look to reestablish federal involvement. Maybe we'll also get to a point where jurisdictions are coming together to work on the best protocols and best practices of the United States for addressing noise pollution. So in those early days, what Dr. Herman was really focusing on is establishing legal precedent for not only having a code, but having it stand when it's been challenged under challenges. And so some of the early work was what you would imagine dealing with a lot of music cases, whether it was nightclubs or street musicians. It was going through the process of enforcing and then having the cases tested in court. And some of them really took, the one thing that I'll be repeating a lot today is enforcement is immensely time intensive. So they took a lot of work to get through the court system once they were in an appeal type situation. So enforcement is really important, but I'm going to repeat, it's it's notably time intensive when you start going down a path of enforcement. Fortunately, for all the cases that Dr. Herman moved forwards, the city had a very high level of winning our cases. I really can't think of any notable cases we lost. There may have been very minor ones. And so as Dr. Herman worked through the first 20 years of the noise office, there were unique things that he navigated. So some that I'll mention, or one of the other ones that I'll mention a little bit later in my chat, is the Portland International Raceway. So noise has definitely improved in the United States for automotive racing, but in the 70s, the city of Portland still had alcohol funny cars racing at a city park that is also a international raceway. So they had these amazingly loud race vehicles that basically had jet engines on them going down part of the racetrack as a big straightaway. And so Dr. Herman's work at that point in terms of enforcement and regulation was trying to figure out how do we regulate and deal with a racetrack facility that is located right in the center of our city. And I'll chat a little bit more about that later. And then an interesting case to note that Dr. Herman navigated was a case with, and this is an issue that may impact some of the folks with noise sources they're dealing with around the United States, the case of a small scale rail operator operating through Portland, but not going over state boundaries. Well, the reason why I mentioned this one, just to help with members of the audience, is we often have ability to deal with noises more effectively when they don't involve interstate commerce. Once it starts to turn into an issue that may have federal preemption, which this would have if the trains had gone over state boundaries, you may have a window to address noise issues when there are not federal preemptions to the noise source. So that's just a real short overview of the early years. And so what really I'm going to focus more on today is because it's more salient to the current the current environment, I should say, around the United States, is my work from 96, in the summer of 96, when I came on board with the city of Portland to present. And so during that time, the early years, what I noticed was Dr. Herman did a great job, but there were some unique challenges that he faced that I was able to have a good understanding of how to address because of my experience in New Jersey. And so in New Jersey, I had this unique element of having enforcement authority on a state level. I worked for a regional environmental enforcement agency called the Essex Regional Health Commission. So I had regional authority. And then because we served a series of jurisdictions, I think it was 14, but it's been a long time, it might have been 12. Each one of those jurisdictions may have had their own codes, own noise codes in this case. And so I could enforce on all those levels. So we applied that in Portland and were able to use the lessons I learned back east to figure out where does your enforcement happen most effectively. So rather than running to what you think or visualize as the highest level, you want to look at noise enforcement from a perspective of where is their staffing, where is their capacity, where is their support. So those are some issues to keep in mind. Then just a few notes I'll mention through the talk. A big reliance in noise enforcement is on our fellow colleagues in government. So in this case, urban planners have been a big help to me because they have forwarded cases to our office for input. So they have an ability in their urban planning reviews in Portland, and I assume in many other jurisdictions, to say, we need an expert eye on this because there's, in this case, an acoustical environmental challenge, and we'd like the city's noise office to look at it. So we expanded our ability to serve the community by working with our partners in other areas. So a few things just to touch on, because these are scenarios I know people are facing. All the years that I've been at the city of Portland, last 3 decades, I've tried to experiment with many different ideas to address noise and figure out ways to enforce tough issues. So a few things we've experimented with over the years are putting remote noise meters in people's homes. And that has turned into not necessarily an effective way to solve noise issues, because you can't move, oops, I'm not sure if that's, sorry, that might have been my computer. I'm not oops. The remote meters in homes issue is a challenge, because making the connect in court that a meter that was measuring sound was unequivocally measuring the thing that you're accusing of the sound is not always so easy. I think as we move forwards, we will probably find that we're back to experimenting with this. Last summer, we experimented with putting some equipment out in the community to measure racetrack noise and to see if AI would help us to identify the racetrack and to figure out how we can measure the racetrack noise. Interestingly, great AI story. When we tried to do that, the meter was measuring aircraft noise that was going overhead, but the AI system was inaccurately accounting that was thunderstorms. So there's definitely a lot of room for AI to make improvements, but it's not quite there for that type of approach. Another quick topic I'm going to talk on today, or mention today, is noise mapping in one quadrant of the city. I'll touch on that in a bit. The other element that we've tried is working with community members and training them to take noise readings. There's some challenges there. There's some also capacity there potentially. We haven't used that on a large scale level, but we've experimented with that in the past. The thing that has worked wonderfully for us, especially with natural environmental program staffing that goes up and down and up and down, at periods when I don't have noise deputies to assist in our office, we've used a lot of affidavits from community members where they just spell out different elements of how they're experiencing sound. So in this case, there's parts of our code that talk about hours of operation. So construction has hours of operation limits. You cannot have loud amplified music go into someone's home after 10 p.m. So in those types of cases, we can actually have someone sign an affidavit saying, loud bass is coming into my home. It's coming from the Bob and Mary nightclub, and we can move cases forward that way. So one thing to touch on is a key component for Portland's program is community involvement. And what I mean by that is Portland has this central concept of involving our citizens in all of our decision making. If you have no voice, you have no say. And so what I mean in this case is, if we just had a noise office where I was running around enforcing things, you really don't have citizens at the wheel and being able to direct where problems are emerging. So the city of Portland has a very unique system that I've lectured on at some of our noise conferences in the United States. It's called the Noise Review Board, and it is a quasi-judicial type body like a planning commission. They're a 6-member body. There is an acoustical sciences representative. There's a construction industry representative. I'm on the board as a non-voting member, and the staff and the technical advisor to them, although we often have an acoustical sciences rep who has an enormous amount of, he or she have an enormous amount of knowledge. And then the thing that's most important that I want to share with the community members at the chat today is there are 3 citizens on the board who vote. So you have 2 votes from industry, so to speak, and you have 3 votes for citizens. So Portland has a long history of trying to make sure citizens are at the wheel, and the Noise Review Board gives citizens an opportunity to have more votes than industry or the technical experts, which I think is unique and is really empowering for the community when they face different emerging noise issues. They are a key element in our city in addressing emerging noise concerns, such as garbage trucks, which I'm going to try to touch on briefly today, outdoor music performance venues, and outdoor music performance in general, and the Portland International Racetrack that I touched on and have a slide where I'll just chat briefly about that. So this is a key component. You must have an advocate. After doing this for 4 decades almost, I have many years where there's just not a person in our elected officials, in the body of our elected officials, that really gets how much noise is a human health issue. And so I use an example of a mayor who served Portland from 1993 to 2005. She was a fellow East Coaster from the New York area. Mayor Katz was a great advocate for noise in the city of Portland. And so when I first got hired on at the city and saw that we had some challenges with enforcement not moving forwards, I advocated heavily for the change in the system to move towards issuing citations, which, they can be up to $5,000, and we can issue multiple citations in a single day. And that would never have happened if we didn't have a champion in somebody like our mayor at the time, who, much like New York City's mayor, when Bloomberg really made wonderful changes to their noise pollution efforts, Mayor Katz was a key ally and an advocate, which is something that we needed. So education versus enforcement. This is an important component. We always think about enforcement, the carrot or the stick. If you don't do it, you're going to get a penalty. Well, that's true. And that was why we changed the City of Portland system from what was turning into challenges with enforcement, where I would take cases before we changed the system. I had to go to county judges, so it was on a county level. And I was lucky when I'd have, 50 hours on a case, construction, for instance, being able to actually move forwards with anything more than a $50 penalty. So I chase after a construction company at 5 a.m, or at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. Then I'd go to the county judge, and sometimes we'd have it thrown out, and they'd say, well, they'll fix it. I'm just going to slap them on the wrist this time. But even when the penalties were applied, they were too low to have any real effect. So that was absolutely a key element. The other thing that I won't chat about a lot today is not only can we issue citations, we can take people, in essence, to court to our code hearings. So there are some complex cases, like the first one I've noted in the second column. We had a case where Safeway Corporation, which is a grocery store in this region, they were doing renovations in a socioeconomically depressed neighborhood, assuming that they'd get away with it. And so they were jackhammering every night until 3, 4, 5 in the morning, and only doing their construction work when they didn't have store hours, so they didn't have to impact their store. Well, in that case, I wound up taking a case to a code hearing, which is one of my enforcement options, and asking for a penalty for, I think it was 36 dates, but I know it was over 30 dates, for approximately a $500 penalty for each date that the issue was occurring. The code hearings officer applied the full penalty amount that I asked for at that point, which was $18,000, and actually said to me, if you had asked for the maximum amount, which for a code hearing, it's different than a citation, it would have been $1,000 per day. The hearings officer said, Mr. Van Orden, if you had asked for the maximum amount, I would have given you the $1,000. This is so egregious. So we do have a unique tool of also being able to take people to hearings, very time intensive, and something that I do less often when our staffing levels are low. Back to the citation component, though, as an example of how our citation authority can be very effective for the community, I have a couple of examples here of nightclubs. We had a nightclub, Barrel Room, one called Lush, another one next door to Lush that was called Level. Well, those were all facilities that were getting penalized, but they weren't taking our enforcement serious. The enforcement starts off lower, so 300, 1,000, 3,000, then jumps up to 5,000. But even as we were approaching the 5,000 mark, they weren't serious. So what we wound up doing, especially with the Barrel Room case, which got a lot of press coverage in Portland a number of years ago, we had a very complex situation where there were multiple nightclubs. So we had to fingerprint that the base issue that was impacting the community was coming from Barrel Room. We did it. We had one deputy noise inspector was out on the street. I had some police officers who were assisting. I was on the rooftop of a hotel, and we started issuing citations and they had at this point had already gotten up to the $5,000 citation. So the first time I came off the roof at the hotel, $5,000. It said, I'm coming back in a half hour. If you haven't turned it down, then we're issuing another one. So on that given night, I believe we had issued about $15,000 in penalty, and that was enough to get their attention and fix the problem. So carrot and stick is great. It is especially great in those rare cases where you have to get to that situation. I have a little note on right-of-way challenges, just as a note for our particular situation in Portland, Oregon. When we are navigating issues that are not property-based, like a nightclub or a industrial facility or our racetrack, when it's out in the public right away, it's a little more of a challenge right now because we've had some recent legislation that's changed in Portland. And so we are having our own challenges trying to navigate things like street musicians who are allowed out in the street, loud car stereos. So our right-of-way issues, we're making some adjustments. Fortunately, we're in the midst of a multi-year project to rewrite some elements of the noise code. So I would assume as that works through the different phases of code change that we would see some changes in that area. So I will share that education is more powerful than enforcement. And I say that because as the city's noise control officer, I have navigated these ups and downs with staffing and have had a few different periods of time where we have not had inspectors to send out in the field. So everything relied on our office team and myself to try and resolve cases. So when staffing is small, educational approaches and components are essential. And so the concept of stretching your resources and gaining more compliance, hundreds of field hours in our office were spent on one particular case where we were dealing with someone using very loud amplification in the public right away. We put all this time into trying to resolve the case. And when it went to a county hearing, because for things in the public right away, we go to the county. For the citations that I issue based on a given property, they're more municipal level, and we can actually move to a lien on the cases. But in this case that was in the public right away, we had, I can't even remember the number of dates because I had built a record on this particular case over a year and a half period of time. And so we had hundreds of hours on it. And then what wound up happening is the court date kept getting pushed back. The court date kept getting pushed back. And then the DA's office eventually sat down with the noisemakers and said, oh, they seem great. They're going to comply. And I said, I'm telling you, after doing this for as many years as I have, we just need to move forward with the court case. Unfortunately, in that case, the case got dropped. And because it sent a message to the noisemakers that somehow in their mind, somehow the county or the city hadn't followed through, then they started to move forward to take action against the county and the city. And so it created a much longer pathway to get the problem solved. They stopped amplifying, but it still will be a long-term situation. So when you can do an education, it is often much more effective than trying to go down these pathways of enforcement. The concepts that I wanted to share about education, one is that proactively you can address noise issues. So when you're getting education out there, it often keeps something from happening. So we process about 400 to 500 quasi-judicial variances to the city code each year. And those act as educational components where someone gets a variance to the code and they also are at the same time learning about what their rights are, but what they have to do to meet the code, even though the variance may give them some additional rights. It winds up being one of those tools that then they share with their friends who are fellow musicians or construction companies. So I just want to say for small programs and small jurisdictions or programs that are just getting started, don't forget about how much education can be more effective than enforcement. And so our office sends out hundreds of letters each year for enforcement to say, hey, you're doing something wrong. You need to fix the issue. But those issues are not, those letters are not necessarily enforcement as much in my mind as they are an additional type of educational component. And I'm watching the time, so I'm going to try to move through things here a little more quickly. Leaf blowers, we've been doing a long-term educational component on leaf blowers because we just passed a new regulation that requires electric and battery powered blowers. So we will not actually start enforcement on this for another year and a half. And that's because when we wrote one of the first noise codes in the United States for leaf blowers, I said to our city council, this is really most effectively an enforcement program because most people will switch over time with the education. When it starts to switch to the enforcement side, it is, as I keep mentioning, a much more challenging situation. So our leaf blower work right now, that can be seen as educational, and we'll get to the enforcement component in about a year and a half. And so just to touch on a couple things briefly, the city of Portland was kind of a lead entity in the United States in looking at noise mapping as a way to help solve things in the community. So back in 2008 and a little bit earlier, we had a project where I identified, and our colleague and our members of our noise review board helped me identify that we have one sector of the city of Portland that was disproportionately being impacted by noise. So they have the Portland International Raceway that I'm touching on. They had an additional NASCAR-like facility that was called the Speedway that just went around in circles that is now has now closed and is a different operation. It's not a racetrack. They have the international airport is in that segment of the city. There's a giant interstate. There's a lot of local trucking for all the industrial areas in the surrounding area. There's train whistle noise and train crossing related noise. So all of those things coalesced where we attempted to use noise mapping rather than enforcement to see if we could determine, is there a disproportionate amount of noise happening in that segment of the city? And it helped with some of the noise sources. It helped direct some of our energy and time on the racetrack situation and lots of staffing time around that. But what wound up happening ultimately, and it's one of the things I touch on at the end, is we didn't get funding to fully finish the project. So always think as you're looking at projects, figuring out how you can make sure that the funding gets you to the end point. We are about 30 minutes in, so I'm just trying to be sensitive to the noise. Am I okay to go for about another 5 on the slides?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just to touch on very briefly, some jurisdictions will be navigating garbage trucks. And so our noise review board and the noise office identified that garbage truck as a noise issue in Portland. It will be different in each city. We're not dealing with a lot of small cans and other things being dumped and waking people up. What we found over a series of years of studying garbage truck noise was that in the city of Portland, we were dealing with the large dumpsters that would get collected on a truck like this, where the forks go into the dumpster, pick it up, and then it goes over the top of the dumpster, over the top of the truck rather, and they bang it several times to empty the trucks. So we actually studied garbage truck noise and then were able to get some funding from the city. And there were 2 studies that were completed to try to resolve this type of noise. And just as an interesting note, one was going to treat these forks with the material much like your cutting boards, so there wasn't metal on metal contact at the forks. And the other was about $80 worth of soundproofing material that was strategically placed on dumpsters to reduce this ringing noise as they were dumping. So those were both projects of the noise review board. There wasn't funding to move it forwards and require that, but I would estimate that as garbage truck noise becomes an issue, a growing issue over time, we probably will revisit this and we may use this approach in a more defined manner. But that was one of the projects of the noise review board. A few other quick notes. We had a urban planning success story where a wind tunnel was being erected in Portland by Freightliner Trucking, which is a division of Mercedes-Benz. And they were going to put in this massive wind tunnel facility to test large 18-wheelers to get them more efficient. And so as that came through our planning elements at the city, they forwarded to me and said, Paul, we'd really like you to look at this. It seems like there could be some noise components. And when I looked at that particular issue, they were proposing using one giant propeller to generate enough wind to go over the truck. And when I did some analysis on it, I said, this is going to create massive base issues which were going to be an issue for an area of residential homes. And then interestingly, where the wind tunnel was located was on a body of water that has a lot of migratory waterfowl. So we also worked with our friends at Audubon and said, we have to find a way to address this both for the community and then also for the migratory waterfowl in the area. And amazing success story. The young engineer who was working on the wind tunnel for Mercedes-Benz Freightliner redesigned the facility. Instead of one giant prop, they put in a series of, I believe it was 18 or 19 props, got rid of the base tunnel issue. We're able to downsize the facility, I think by 2/3, saved an enormous amount of money on the construction. And it was just a great story of how to address these things at the front end. I have a note, not going to go into our code specifics much today, but you must, in noise codes you're writing, not just use a dBA standard, but you must have an element in your code that helps you to address bass. So in our code, we have a octave analysis part of the code. And so that allows us to fingerprint, like that nightclub case. I could zoom in and measure and be able to say in court, yes, I fingerprinted the bass coming from this facility, not that facility. And so that's a key component. I have a very important piece to touch on, which is staffing to enforce is intense. So if you don't have a lot of staffing, you will be in a situation where you're doing daily triaging in order to address issues. And I already touched on noise at the front end is the way to address the issue. Just going to say very briefly, there are lots of challenges for equitably enforcing noise. And so we work very diligently in the city of Portland to figure out, with the small resources we have, how do we spread that out as fair as we can? And so, for instance, we had a case recently where there was a community of primarily immigrant community members. So a lot of them were impacted, but did not necessarily want to put their name down as being impacted by a nightclub that was operating death metal shows till 2-3 in the morning that could be heard quite some distance away, pretty bass intensive, and also kind of electronic dance music, but right in the midst of the neighborhood. And, fortunately, we did have a community member who was helpful in coming forwards when the other folks didn't want to come forwards. And we were able to resolve that case, but we're always trying to look at our cases and figure out how can we make sure with the limited resources we have, we spread them evenly. Couple of last notes. In being effective, make sure you have a environmental health expert who understands this work, because I've seen so many times when I look at other jurisdictions or other cases, they don't have that. So if you can get someone to the table or have a person on staff, that's a key component. Make sure you have funding. I mentioned that became a challenge with our mapping project, that we didn't get a chance to fully finish it, even though we learned an enormous amount from the project. An outreach body. See, I have a typo there. The noise review, not the BARD, but the board. The noise review board type of approach of having community members involved is really effective in having people have a stake in how they're impacted by this environmental health issue. Staff on the board, same issue of just having somebody who's your expert in general. Your actual staff, I've seen a lot of mistakes where jurisdictions have hired people with a real strong planning background, but they don't have the science and the math and the things it really takes to make the noise component come together. I've talked a lot already about the enforcement is not as effective necessarily as education, but also recognizing, as a last piece, just to help people who are working in issues in their community, taking audio recordings and videos and things may be helpful to a certain level, but when you actually move to an enforcement level, those are not as effective as you might think they would be. So I just wanted to touch briefly on that. And I think that is the last slide. Thank you for letting me go a little late.
So thank you so much, Paul. That was great. And it touched on so many issues that characterize a lot of noise sources that other communities are really trying to grapple with. So I really appreciate that. We have a number of questions. So why don't I just take them one at a time? And if any are repeated, I'll try and move to the next one. The first one is, could you talk about troublesome factors of noise apart from volume? And you've, of course, talked about bass components and so forth. In other words, what science or tools are out there that shows noise sound can be disturbing based on frequency, context, origin, and other factors. And they give examples of nuisance dog barking, buzzing machinery, time of day that it's experienced, whether somebody's sleeping, they're working, they're dealing with children, etc.
Well, that's a great question. So, going all the way back to the beginning of the noise code, they recognized that this was a serious issue. And so we actually have penalties in the Portland Noise Code if something is tonally intensive. So, to use a very exaggerated example, but it's in the same realm, we have, trying to think what you would call them, little bodegas in Portland. They're like 7-Elevens and places of that nature that will put these devices on the building to scare away uh, teenagers or homeless community members, and they will emanate a really high pitched sound to just make it annoying to stay in that location for more than a very short period. And so these types of tonal issues have penalties in the noise code, as well as the octave band analysis that allows us to fingerprint very specific levels. And you're penalized more in our code for higher pitch sounds, because if you're at 55 decibels at a very bass intensive level, it's not nearly as impactful to a community member as a very high pitched sound that's at 55 decibels. So if community members look at our code, you'll see that one of the ways to address it is to write in protections in the code based on tonality factors and enforcement around tonality.
Yeah, thank you. So just for our audience, tonal components and noise is sound that occurs within very narrow frequency bands. It can be high pitched, and at higher frequency, it can be low frequency. This is a problem with data center noise right now, that you have tonal components at low frequency that are causing humming, whining, whooshing sounds that are disturbing people. So tonality is very, very important. So a couple of questions from one person. Can you share any experience with illegal mufflers, modified vehicles, and also with emergency vehicle sirens?
Yes, absolutely. So we had an interesting scenario in the city of Portland where we were asked to be one of the cities to have the 100-year anniversary of Harley Davidson. And so in one of our parks, we had a massive gathering of motorcycles. And as part of that permit to use that park, they were going to have live bands. So they had to come before the city's noise review board. So we established that, and this is just an example, but it plays out with other examples of exhaust noise. We wound up having an agreement with Harley Davidson and the promoter that we would have active enforcement going on during the event for folks who are using straight pipes and excessively loud exhausts. Enforcement of exhaust components is very challenging, and we have some unique challenges we're facing in Oregon right now around it that hopefully as we do our code rewrite, we can address it. But we did at that point effectively issue citations. They are in our city for exhaust. A fix-it ticket is the way it's in our code, meaning you have X number of days to fix the issue, have it retested, and then a judge will drop the ticket. But if you don't get it fixed, then the ticket stands as a fiscal penalty. The disconnect for us, just as a quick side note, is the place where we were sending those vehicles to get retested was our state air emissions facilities, and they are not able currently to do the acoustic test for us. So we're trying to fix that particular disconnect, which may be a challenge in other jurisdictions around the country. So there are definitely ways to address it. It just can be intensive. I don't know if that answers the question fully for the community member.
So that was for the modified vehicles, but then there was also the question about the emergency sirens and so forth.
Yes. So emergency sirens, we have had some luck over the years where I've chatted with our variety of entities that were, how would I say this? They were operating their sirens at a more than necessary level. We've been able to work with them to make some adjustments over the years. I would not necessarily say that that has fully resolved the concerns that community members might raise, but we have had some luck just because we have an office that people can turn to chat with our our fire bureaus or police bureaus. Mostly, in our case, our really loud sirens have been with private contractors who are tied to our ambulance services. And so that's where we've had our most work to try and resolve community issues.
Great, thank you. I just want to go back a minute with the Harley Davidson example. It sounds like the Noise Review Board, or I'm sorry if I didn't get the name right, but that board, is it involved in permitting processes for these events, projects, proposals?
Yes. So the Noise Review Board uh, is involved when someone wants to make more noise than the city code allows. So that could be construction, that could be a event like the Harley Davidson event, that could be just about anything where someone is looking to make more noise than the code allows. If it's minor and it's not impacting as large a part of the community as this Harley Davidson event, then I process about 400 or so of those myself. But the larger events go to the Noise Review Board for review. So it's a community decision.
The next question says, if there were a source of help outside of Portland, what kind of help would be of assistance to Portland or to similar communities?
If there was a source of help, what would be? I think what I see would be most helpful is people organizing around this issue to empower each other. So your organization is a great example of ways that people can come together, because a lot of it is not having, what I see when I look across the country is there's a lack of knowledge, and then there's a lack of stakeholders united to help resolve issues. So I think part of it is just building a community around the fact that this is a serious health issue that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Next question, do you use DBA levels, reasonable person standards, or other standards to define noise pollution?
Well, we're using, I didn't really get to touch on it in my presentation. We're using DBA as an instantaneous maximum level. And so what I mean for this person's question is, when I go out and someone has complained about something, I'm trying to determine if it exceeds a city code it's not averaged over time. Some of our variances have different descriptors, but the code itself will have instantaneous levels. So let's just say we're talking about an industrial neighborhood and it's an industrial property to another industrial property. It can be as loud as 75 decibels. So does that mean I go out and for 2 seconds it's 80 decibels and they get a citation? No, we look at it, we try and determine if we can make an argument that, wow, there's a regular noise that's exceeding the code, then we would take enforcement actions. So there are strengths and weaknesses to this approach. The strength right now with limited funding in the United States to noise issues is a person in my position as the health professional can resolve a lot more cases. When you use a more European standard of measuring over time, you can address things like data centers better potentially, where the sound is the same for hours. So there are pros and cons, but the DBA approach we use would all fall apart if we didn't also have that octave-band analysis, which would be something that we could use with a data center type scenario. So I see a lot of bad codes that are just DBA, and they don't really solve these problems for community members. So that's a great question the person has asked about in terms of the approach we use.
Thank you. The next, it's not really a question, but it's a thank you from one of the leaders of Quiet Clean PDX on leaf blowers and the citywide ban that has been enacted by the city. So the question that they pose related to that is, how can you and the office conduct public outreach and education of the citywide Portland ban? Because it seems that there is currently no programming for that by the city, despite the assertion that the city's trying to do that?
That's a great question. I think if members of Quiet Clean PDX come to the noise review board, they may be able to bridge with the noise review board. And we have something called our Portland Clean Energy Fund, which is kind of an amazing, groundbreaking kind of funding methodology in the city of Portland. It could be something where we could approach the Portland Clean Energy Fund because they have been monumentally helpful with finding funding to offer small landscape businesses money to actually buy electric blowers. There might be some opportunities there where, with the support, which I think they would get from the city's noise review board and their own body of community members who are involved with their organization, to see if we can't find some ways to further magnify that educational component as we get closer to the period where we're in the enforcement mode.
Great, thank you. So this next question is interesting, and its context is that it's kind of a psychological question. How do you address or deal with the us-them mentality that's related to noise issues? And the comment is usually it becomes those who can't tolerate noise and others who don't care and argue it's no big deal. I would say that, having language around noise that's almost entrenched, and this is me talking, that noise is an annoyance or a nuisance doesn't help when it's a public health issue.
It's a great question, and it is a major component of what all of our staff all the years at the noise office navigate to most effectively help the community. So what I mean specifically about that is we are regularly operating in a more social worker mode to help when someone is being inappropriate and saying, they're just being Karenistic, or this is not reasonable, I should have a right to do this. They're just hypersensitive, all these things of that nature. And so we work diligently, or when I'm training Portland police officers, to remind folks this is an actual health issue. This is not somebody being overly sensitive. Yes, a certain number of people may be more sensitive than other community members, but when the noise office is involved, it's at a point where we've determined there's a potential health issue here. We need to address it. So we work hard, especially when we have our staff meetings, to talk through what is effectively directing the person who's saying the inappropriate language back to the point that it's a health issue. We're not always successful, but I have to say, because it is a social work like component, a lot of these discussions I have with community members who are the person saying it's not an issue, I disagree, I should be able to do whatever I want, whatever that type of dialogue is, after I get done talking to them, we usually have arrived at a point of better understanding how someone could be impacted by these noises. It's really interesting. So much of it is science. So when I start to talk, musicians are a great example. I'll give you an example that answers this person's question. Someone's practicing in their basement. To them, they walk outside and they go, oh, it's not that loud. And then when I explain from a science perspective, well, you're outside and there's all this ambient stuff going on, but your neighbor next door has the roadway noise and everything else blocked, and all they're getting is this intense bass from your band rehearsal, and it's driving them crazy. Well, I have a lot of musicians, and I'm a musician myself, that when I start to explain these types of just very scientific perspectives, they're like, wow, I've never thought about that. I said, yeah, the bass wavelengths are actually really gigantic. Some of them are just forming in that distance in the neighbor's home. And so they're getting the full brunt, and you're outside walking around. You don't even realize it. You're just like, oh, it doesn't sound that bad to me. So we try as hard as we can to find the science to be able to educate people that it's not just someone being sensitive. It's not just an annoyance. It is truly a health issue.
Yeah. We've also found that when people that tend to dismiss these problems are then subjected to the exposure themselves, they often change their minds pretty quickly. And they can say, that personal experience of it becomes very important. And when you can't do that, the kind of explanation you're talking about, I think can be enormously helpful. Okay, we're going to have more questions here than we can handle, but I'll try and get through a few more, and then maybe, we can send Paul some of the others and get back to people. Um, has anyone involved in large data centers looked at the city's focus on base noise in order to determine if there's something that can be done about what neighbors are experiencing that live next to large data centers? I mean, this is a problem that's happening all over the country.
Well, I think that's the big question right now. And I think jurisdictions who are proactive are trying to figure out how to change their state, local regulations to address that part of the component of data centers. That, it is moving forwards in a positive direction, but rewriting codes is always slow. So I have great hope, and I'm trying to be actively involved myself in this dialogue around the country. It is definitely getting momentum, but it's at a very early stage, I think, from what I'm seeing in terms of obviously without real involvement at the federal level, we don't have that federal oversight to help. So it is a more localized state and, potentially county, city, town type of situation.
Does Portland also have a property nuisance ordinance, and has there been any successful use of such against low frequency or persistent tonal noise?
We have there is a whole nuisance program that deals with all kinds of issues, but anything that's going to have that tonality issue is going to bounce back to our office. So when there is a tonal component, which is often bass, we can deal with that in the noise office. Again, the toughest challenge about dealing with any issue is sometimes the intermittent nature of it. So even if we have a bass tonal issue, we may come out and not be able to catch it to measure it. So sometimes that turns into the bigger challenge to resolve issues. Not so much that there's not a tool, it's catching it to measure it to take an action.
I just want to mention one of our colleagues has said that, for data center noise, where you have these strong tonal components within the low frequency part of the spectrum, that 1/3 octave band analysis can actually miss a lot of it. And he recommends doing narrow band frequency analysis, really insisting on it. He he has a industrial vibration and noise center in England, and does work with data centers all over. And it would be good to put you together to talk about that too.
Absolutely. And the good news is we only get to really rewrite the city's noise code about every 20 years or more. Sometimes it's a little longer when we systematically go through it. We are definitely looking to expand away from just third octave. I'm sorry, expand from full octave and go much more broad so that we can address issues. Especially nowadays, it used to be a challenge the last time they rewrote the noise code because meters weren't at the level they're at today to just very easily measure these things. So that's something we are actually also addressing here in Portland.
And it's so encouraging to hear that you and the city are really appreciating that noise goes so far beyond just a decibel measure, to these other characteristics that really bear importantly on human impact and health and on environmental impact. Okay, let's see. We have 3 more minutes. Rather than fines or penalties, has there been any thought to incentivizing business or commercial activities to reduce noise? In other words, less noise equals less money spent.
I don't know that I have a great example of that situation, but in terms of incentivizing, when I've experimented with different approaches over the years, we've often had situations where we have enforcement against young people, like college age. And so to try and incentivize not just giving them a penalty, but having a way they can resolve the issue, I have had some success in the past learning from one of my colleagues in New York City, Julia Slang, about using community court approaches. So I remember one particular case that comes to mind where a young woman was producing shows out in the street and driving her neighbors crazy. So just, full blown concerts out in the street. And we wound up taking a case against her. And rather than issuing a fiscal penalty, I asked the judge to have her volunteer we had a dangerous decibels display at our local science museum. And this person wound up, because they didn't really have the fiscal means to pay the citations, they wound up volunteering at the dangerous decibels display. So I don't know that really fits the question, but we try to find approaches of that nature. I don't know if we have a perfect one for the answer for the question, though.
One of our legal advisors, in fact, he heads our legal advisory council, was in charge of compliance for the state of Massachusetts on toxics, but he applies the same thinking to noise. There's a win-win here if the offending source is a piece of equipment that hasn't been maintained or is old and less energy efficient, and going either with a well-maintained, with maintenance, or new equipment that can reduce noise, you often also get that energy reduction benefit as well that can save money.
Absolutely.
Okay, a couple of other questions. Paul, how do you promote the acoustical efficiency of machines, equipment, and tools to reduce noise emission? I guess that's related. I didn't see this right away. How to promote acoustical eco-design for zero noise emissions?
That's a tough one just because I wish we had some real solid budget for education in our office, and we don't necessarily. So when I talk to people, or when our staff talk to people, we'll mention the concern, but I don't know that we really have an effective way in getting that messaging out around the topic. I think our leaf blower project's been great because it is, with a lot of work from our planning agency, a lot has been spent to get the word out. And I'm surprised when I just talk to average people that they know about it. So that is at least an example of putting the time in and energy to get the word out is effective, but not sure if I have a perfect answer on this one either.
Yeah, and I know for that there was quite an organized citizen effort and outreach effort on that end, apart from the city, that I'm sure was helpful as well.
The neighbors actually in that case were volunteering and passing out postcards all over the city. So there was a lot of work to go and just get the word out door to door. And so that was definitely citizen driven, which I said is a really important component in having noise be addressed effectively.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I am delighted but afraid that as we've been talking more and more, we've had more and more questions come up. If you're willing, maybe we can save these and pass these on and provide some answers, gather some answers and provide them to the people that are asking.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
feel free, through that email up, feel free to shoot me an email and try to answer general questions as best as I can to help out.
Well, thank you so very much. This was really, really great. I'm going to just turn it over to Trish to close it out, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jamie. And thanks, Paul. I echo Jamie's gratitude for your sharing your presentation, your expertise. I know it'll inspire others to organize and those facing community noise challenges. Quiet communities.